Grace and peace. I'm Brian Musser. I'm the Baptist Campus Minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Bible Study. The peace of Jesus Christ to change your life, the power of the Holy Spirit to change the world. And we are continuing our Bible study in looking at the book of 1 John. This week we'll be looking at John chapter 2, verses 14 through 23. I titled this In This Corner as we're really dealing with the opponents of John, who he has been kind of helping the congregation that he is writing to defend themselves against. Right now we're going to follow an idea through the passage. This is the second video this week, and we take an idea and follow it through not just this passage, but the entirety of 1 John. And that idea is the opponents. But before we do, I want to ask a question. Have you ever met a postmodern? Now, postmodernism is this idea that, all truth is relative, that we don't have the user experience, the observer experience kind of defines what's going on. And because this world out here exists only inside your head, that what you think is true is actually true since you are the observer and all that kind of stuff. There's really very little foundational truth in existence. And there's a lot to it. Now, I've met a lot of people influenced by postmodern philosophy, postmodern thought, that they are definitely no longer moderns. But are they truly completely 100% postmoderns? I mean, postmodern isn't really something that anyone is completely following. It is this mixture of belief systems that best describe in generic types some of what any one of us may hold. But I've met very few people that I'm like, that's the epitome of a postmodern. They check every single box in the postmodern belief system. So it's this way that I just wanted to bring this up, and I think it can relate, that a lot of people you run into have been severely and significantly influenced by postmodernism. But very few people you run into are textbook definition postmoderns. And that's going to be important for us to see as we look into John's opponents. And looking at this passage, what do we actually know from 1 John? So the opponents in 1 John are labeled as the Antichrist, which we saw in the passage this week, and false prophets, which comes later in the book, and claim to be in fellowship with God, but do not keep his commands. They deny that they're sinful. They hate their brothers. They deny Jesus is the Messiah who came in the flesh. They are actively trying to deceive the congregation or the audience, the church that John is writing to. And if we look at 2 John, they seem to think they have progressed in truth beyond the gospel. That's the information, and their verse is referencing there. That's the information about John's opponents that we can pick up from 1 John. The interesting thing is that this kind of matches up with several thought movements that we know are in existence in the first or second or even third century Greco-Roman world. Now, just like how very few people are completely postmodern, John's opponents represent some parts of some of these philosophies, but very few, they aren't completely right, and they don't fit perfectly. They're sort of just kind of in the same category as the opponents John's talking about. So a lot of commentators refer to John's opponents as the cessationists because it seems like they have left the congregation. They were somehow in the church John is writing to, but have now moved on from that church, have left that church, are now outside of that church. And they did this on their own will. Now, Ignatius, about the year 117, warned of unbelievers that taught Jesus only appeared to suffer and did not confess that he was flesh bearing, is the word Ignatius used. Um, and this is kind of typically referred to as doceticism. And that developed later than what John is looking at, than when First John was written, but it's sort of like the very tip of the tongue coming at it. We can see that some of the things John is going against is the same as what Ignatius is writing about several years later. Then Irenaeus, about middle of the second century, talks of an Ephesian, a particular Ephesian named Cerinthius, who was John's contemporary, who taught the Spirit of Christ came on Jesus. Jesus was just an ordinary man at his baptism, and at some time before the crucifixion, that Spirit of Christ departed the man of Jesus. Again, this idea of doceticism. Irenaeus relates a story he heard from Polycarp, who was a direct disciple of John. So John discipled Polycarp. Polycarp told Irenaeus about John refusing to be in the same building with this heretic Cerinthius, for fear that when God brought judgment on Cerinthius, anybody near him might actually get hurt as well. Kind of like it was a bathhouse, and John was like saying, if lightning's going to strike Cerinthius in this bathhouse, will probably knock the bathhouse down. I don't want to get hit by the bathhouse. So um, he just wanted to stay away from Cerinthius, and the story is like he ran out of the building because of it. Um, so there's this asceticism, there's this Greek dualism, and there's Cerinthius kind of all coming together. Irenaeus again is referencing this. This guy is a Gnostic, um, and he's Egyptian, living in Rome. He may have written something called the Gospel of Truth. We're not completely sure he is the author of it, but this is what Irenaeus says about Valentinus and about Valentinus' beliefs. For just as it is impossible that material substance should partake of salvation, since indeed they maintain that it is incapable of receiving it, so it is impossible that the spiritual substance by which they mean themselves should ever come under the power of corruption, whatever sort of actions in which they indulged. So Heraclian, a student of Valentinus, wrote an entire Gnostic commentary on the Gospel of John. The Gnostics loved the Gospel of John. And it's interesting, some Gnostics like started Christian and added Gnosticism to Christianity. Some were Gnostics and added a little bit of Christianity to Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is this big mix of similar but sometimes divergent philosophies that just kind of took Greek dualism to another step. The material world is evil, the spiritual world is good. Things that are spiritual cannot be corrupted and should not associate with the material world. And the idea of Gnosticism is not gnosis, this idea of knowledge. Knowledge brought spiritual people into salvation. When they learned, when they knew that to separate themselves from the material world, when they were given that knowledge, that's when it led to them their salvation. And the Gnostics really, really picked up on the Gospel of John. And even so, somebody like wrote a commentary on it, which is interesting because like a lot of people think that First John is written so that to interpret the Gospel of John in the right idea, to counter false interpretations of the Gospel of John. Berge, Cohick, and Green say there is a surprising lack of interest in John's writing among the second century writers, as many scholars believe it was the letters of John, First John in particular, that redeemed the fourth Gospel for the New Testament. The heretics had taken the Gospel of John and so interpreted with Gnostic beliefs, these were just the beginning of these Gnostic beliefs, and so interpreted that way that a lot of Orthodox Christians didn't really want to deal with the Gospel of John. And First John helps them grasp the Gospel of John in an Orthodox manner and not in a heretical manner. But some other things, some other Gnostic ideas that kind of will be influencing how we look at these opponents. There is no sin. This is the gospel of Mary. There is no sin, but it is you who make sin when you do the things that are like the nature of adultery, which is called sin. That is why good came into your midst to the essence of every nature in order to restore it to its roots. This idea that if we say we don't sin, can be seen that in this Gospel of Mary is like even adultery is not really sin. You just call it sin. And if you learn that you're spiritual beings, even what's happening in the physical world won't matter. Gospel of Thomas attributes this saying to Jesus. Jesus said, if the flesh came into being because of spirit, it is a wonder. But if spirit came into being because of the body, it is a wonder of wonders. Indeed, I am amazed at how this great wealth has been made its home in this poverty. So this Gospel of Thomas is talking about this huge dichotomy, this dualism between the spirit and the material, between the flesh and the spirit, between the body and the spirit. And obviously, the spirit is the good, the body is the bad, and they're putting this Gnostic philosophy even in the mouth of Jesus here, separating this dualism. So now, Daniel Aiken, in his New American Commentary on the Letters of John, kind of explains the opponents this way. They had a new theology. John's opponents compromised the uniqueness of the person and work of Jesus. In response, John says Jesus Christ is the incarnate Son of God whose death provides forgiveness against sin. Also, they had a new morality. The opponents of John minimize the importance of sin. They claim to have fellowship with God despite their unrighteous behavior. But John in First John over and over again talks about obedience, like we saw last time. Christianity has ethical implications. Fellowship with God requires righteousness. And then they had new spirituality. Their teachings resulted in spiritual arrogance. Consequently, they did not show love to others. But First John goes, God is love. Thus, love for fellow Christians is the mark of true Christianity. So that's kind of John's opponents in this letter of First John. They were sort of Gnostic influence, probably predated Gnosticism, but they were influenced by the ideas that eventually become Gnostics. They had some similarities with what Cerinthius taught. They had some similarities with Doceticism. They were kind of related to all these, but they weren't completely the same as these things. But it helps us grasp what John is dealing with. I hope that helps you understand who John's opponents were in this letter of First John. As always, there are two ways to engage this conversation live Monday nights or on these weekly wrap-ups via YouTube and WordPress. I'm all over social media, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, YouTube. Those links are in the description. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to talk to you again real soon.